Hello, today is Tuesday, April 28th, 2020. I just wanted to read to you guys chapter 6 from our Flat Stanley book. Chapter 6, Emma. Mr. Lambchop came home early the next afternoon, full of excitement. Guess what, he said. The old Merker department store downtown, 8 floors, all emptied out, waiting to be torn down. Well, last night most of it fell down by itself. He switched on the TV. News time. Let's get the latest. More on the Merker building. Collapse, a newscaster was saying. It's just a mountain of rubble now, folks. 3 workmen have been treated for minor bruises, but no other injuries are reported. The public is requested to avoid the area until a young woman ran on, handed him a slip of paper, and ran off again. Hold on, this just in. The newscaster read it from the slip. Wow, a little girl is trapped under all that wreckage? Emma Weeks, daughter of local businessman Oswald Weeks. Emma Weeks? Stanley exclaimed. She's in my class. No wonder she wasn't at school today. Emma's not hurt, it appears, the newscaster continued. Firemen called to the scene can hear calling up through the chinks in the wreckage, demanding food and water. But Fire Chief Johnson has forbidden any rescue efforts. Any disturbance, any shifting of the wreckage, he says, might bring the rest of the building crashing down. Now, here's Tom Miller. The TV screen showed a reporter with a microphone standing by the wrecked building. Emma Weeks? Shouted the reporter, holding his microphone up to the crack. Do you hear me? Are you all right? Emma's voice was faint. Check that out. Faint but clear. Oh, sure, I'm just great. I hope a building falls on me every day, you know. Come on, get me out of here. Mrs. Lambchop sighed. Such an unfortunate tone. She's under a great strain, of course. Emma's always like that, Stanley said. Half an hour later, while Mrs. Lambchop was preparing supper, a siren sounded outside, then died away. Opening the front door, Mr. Lambchop saw a fire department car at the curb. On the doorstep stood Fire Chief Johnson and a very worried-looking man and woman. Mr. Lambchop, said Chief Johnson. I'll get right to the point, sir. I reckon you heard about little Emma Weeks, trapped in the Merker wreck. Well, Mr. and Mrs. Weeks here and me, we'd like a word with you folks. Of course, Mr. Lambchop led the visitors into the house and introduced them to his family. Oh, Mrs. Weeks, Mrs. Lambchop cried, your poor daughter. You must be dreadfully worried. We are indeed, said Mr. Weeks. But Chief Johnson thinks your Stanley might be able to save Emma. Who, me? And who's Stanley? Said Stanley and Arthur. Chief Johnson explained. The problem is that if a policeman or any of my firemen tries to dig his way into Emma, the whole rest of the building could crash down on them. Too bad we don't have a flat fireman, I was thinking. That flat fella could squeeze through all the narrow openings. We know there are, because we hear Emma when she calls. Then I recollect the newspaper story with a picture of Stanley here. hit me right away. That boy could make maybe even wiggle to Emma. For a moment, everyone was silent. Then Mrs. Lambchop shook her head. Sounds terribly dangerous, she said. I'm sorry, but I must say no. It's a tad risky, ma'am, said the Chief Johnson. We've got to remember, the boy is already flat. Mrs. Weeks sobbed. Oh, poor Emma. How are we to save her? Mrs. Lambchop bit her lip. Stanley remembered something. I was just thinking. He turned to Mr. Lambchop. The other night, when I got mad about all the crazy things that keep happening to me, remember what you said? You said that sometimes things happen that nobody can see a reason for. And then afterwards, some other things happen. And all of a sudden, it just seems like the first thing had a reason after all. Well, I was just thinking that me getting flat again was one crazy thing. And that maybe Emma getting stuck, where I'm the only one who could save her, might be the second thing. Mr. Lambchop nodded and took Mrs. Lambchop's hand. We should be very proud of our son, Harriet, Mrs. Lambchop thought for a moment. Stanley, she said at last, will you be very, very careful not to let that enormous building fall on you? Okay, sure, Stanley said. Mrs. Lambchop turned to Mr. and Mrs. Weeks. We will allow Stanley to help, she said. He will do his best for Emma. Fine boy we got here. Brave as a lion, shouted Chief Johnson. Now listen up, folks. Mrs. Lambchop, you help me get things ready. Then Stanley, you go right in after Emma. Got that? Everybody meet us at the Merker building 30 minutes from now. Tomorrow, we'll read chapter 7. Where are you, Emma? See you tomorrow.